Hey everyone, this video is about nuclear power, aka the research reactor in ONI, everything I know about it, and some of the lesser known benefits. So before we can talk about nuclear power, we need to talk about the two major options you have in the late mid game for both power and rocket fuel. I consider there to be two major tech paths that you can choose between, one of them being petroleum, which leads to building a petroleum boiler fueled by magma at the bottom of your planet or a magma volcano, and the nuclear reactor, which requires uranium harvested from betas. Both these methods provide a large amount of power and rocket fuel. There are a couple other major options for power that you can go for, but those namely being right now the sour gas boiler and the geothermal plant. And while these both can produce very large amounts of power, I don't really consider them to be on the same level as petroleum or the nuclear reactor, because both of those methods do not produce rocket fuel. So if you are making a sour gas boiler, you still need to make a petroleum boiler or run refineries in order to get your rocket fuel. If you are going for a geothermal plant, you will still need to get a radiation source for your rad rockets, or again a petroleum source, because all you really get out of that is steam. And steam rockets aren't good enough. They're a starter rocket. They are not a mid-game rocket. In order to actually fully access the star map, you need petroleum or radiation, period. So first off, let's talk about the harvesting of the uranium. You want to use betas, end of story. Digging up the uranium tiles costs you half the mass, and then I think refining them is only like 20% efficiency using the structure for it, or something like that. It's really bad. So you get a very, very, very small amount of uranium compared to how much mass is actually there. Betas will fly around, dig through the tiles. They will also pick up uranium on the solid ground, take it back to their hive, and refine it, and it will stock up in here. This one doesn't have much, and this one has quite a bit, as you can see, because they've had quite a bit of uranium to dig through. This is essentially the kind of setup you want to use. You want to basically, this entire area was filled with uranium, so I just made a little ledge here. You move one baby bee onto the ledge into a little doored off area, and you want to have these doored off because their pathing is ridiculous and takes up a lot of processing power. And so if they can path like really, really large areas, it can slow down your game by quite a bit, especially if you have a lot of bees. We've got a couple of them. This is on Blasted Series max difficulty, and this map starts with, at least for me, started with 3 radioactive biomes of varying size, and these have provided more than enough uranium. We're now towards the end of this run, 1,500 cycles in, like all goals are complete, and I still have more than enough uranium to last thousands of cycles before you'd have to resort to space mining. So the amount of uranium you get from even just moderately sized biomes is one of those things that's effectively infinite. It's not truly infinite, but as far as I'm concerned, if something will last you long enough that you will finish all your goals with the run and move on to the next run before it runs out, it is, for all intents and purposes, infinite. So I do consider uranium to be an infinite source, and again, you can get it from space mining, although space mining is kind of a pain in the ass and is something I usually don't do unless I really get forced into it. So a few basic things about the research reactor. First off, in order to avoid a meltdown, there needs to be water in the reactor, which is this left bar right here. This right bar, the rectangular one, is the fuel. This left bar will deplete relatively quickly every time it spits out water, which is every time you see this animation up top. It will use up a little water, so you want to make sure water is always in the reactor. If it is missing water, if this bar hits 0, it will overheat incredibly quickly. If you look at the temperature of the uranium and how quickly it goes up, we're on 3x speed. But as you can see, it's gaining, like 200 degrees on that uranium in a matter of seconds. That heat is transferred to the water is ejected, and new water has to be injected in order to keep the reactor cool. This will, if this number right here, this enriched uranium, the one that's actually going up, if this hits 2700 degrees, you hit a meltdown. If the reactor cannot eject the previously hot water due to it being overpressured, which happens at, I believe, 150 kg per tile of pressure, you will also hit a meltdown. So essentially, to keep the reactor from melting down, you want to always make sure there is water going into the reactor, and you want to always make sure the pressure never gets too high. If you do these two things, you will avoid a meltdown. I'm going to go over the piping real quick. Here's the overlays for liquid. Obviously, there's not much for gas. Here's the power. Here's the automation, which I will cover more in a bit here. And here's the conveyance, which is mainly used to supply uranium to the reactor itself. These are just like food deposit boxes, basically, to reduce the amount of Duke travel time for the mutated plants. Okay, so a few words on the liquids and the coolant. As far as the coolant goes, I'm using super coolant in here right now. You can also use the liquid nuclear waste. You need to be careful with this, though, because if this liquid nuclear waste ever sits anywhere, then it causes corrosive element damage, which causes things to break. It cannot be stored. It must always be moving. I did try to use this as coolant early on in this design, and I had issues with some of it sitting in the aqua tuner. This was before I fully understood the corrosive element damage, and I believe that the error I made when I was filling the loop was that I put too much in it, and when the aqua tuner turned off and it was just flowing through the loop, a little bit was staying in this pipe and would cause it to break. I believe if you are using liquid nuclear waste and you just make sure you don't overfill it, like, have a couple empty tiles in your loop, then like the way I have one empty tile here, except maybe have like 2 or 3, then you should be able to avoid having that corrosive element damage issue. Obviously, super coolant just makes your life a lot easier. If you want to use polluted water or anything with an SHC roughly around 4 instead of the LNW super coolant SHC about 8, then you will need a second aqua tuner, because it's normally one aqua tuner to about 5 turbines, give or take, but with super coolant or, a high SHC liquid like LNW, you can do 1 to 10. So as far as the loops go here, it should be pretty self-evident. We've got our coolant loop, which just cools the reactor, and that's it. And then just cools the turbine. That's it, and then comes back in. The interesting part and the important part is how you hook up your water pipes. So as you can see right now, I have the water coming out from all the turbines, and then this bridges back over here because to make sure that when this thing starts up, usually the bottom turbines will start working first, and you want that water to always be going through the reactor first. If it can't flow through the top pipe, it just dumps out here, and same with the top one. If the reactor doesn't need any water, it just dumps out over here. It's important to have these two vents not near where you put your pump, because if water drops onto this and gets sucked up inside of it, this thing is 200 degrees. The water can boil inside it or inside the pipes and will cause element damage. I had issues when I had one of these vents over on the left. You can actually kind of see where it used to be before I started, before I had to modify this. And having both these vents over on the right avoided that issue. This simply pumps liquid nuclear waste out and down. Where it's going, we'll talk about in a moment here. As far as the automation goes, this is just censored for liquid nuclear waste to make sure it's actually there, hooked up with an AND gate, along with a timer sensor that just keeps this on a quarter of the time to prevent it from running more than it needs to. I just played with these values till it seemed to roughly, be about right, and this seemed to be about good. I could probably reduce it a bit more, maybe go 1575 or 1590, but that's not a necessary thing. That was just to reduce the overall power draw of everything in the reactor and give me more power available for the rest of the base. Okay, so about the fuel injection. So the reactor can run on varying amounts of uranium. As you can see, we've got 60 kg of uranium in here. It can run, on 10 kg, 20 kg, etc. The more uranium you put in here, the hotter your reactor is going to run, the more power you're going to get out of it. But you need to be also a little careful regarding your steam temperature as well as the gases that immediately come out of the reactor, because they can come out very hot. In here, we're using steel on the aqua tuners, the pumps, and the auto sweeper, which means that were we to exceed 275 degrees Celsius, these things would break. So I'm generally pretty careful. I've played with this enough that I've noticed that roughly 50 kg of uranium in the reactor, give or take, seems to be about the sweet spot for getting virtually all the power out of the turbines, but without having the entire thing run too hot. And that brings us to the injection system. So we have a bin here which stores all the enriched uranium. We have 5 tons in there. That gets fed into this conveyor loader, and this conveyor loader is attached to a conveyor meter. This conveyor meter is hooked up to a AND gate, which is hooked up to a switch and a timer. These two switches are how you control the reactor. The top switch enables the reactor itself. The bottom switch adds additional water into the reactor from the main water line. The bottom switch is only relevant when you're starting up the reactor. This timer right here is set to 0.1 for every 599.9 seconds. You want it to turn on just briefly, oh so briefly, once every cycle. Along with this set to 10, these are in kg. And what that means is when this thing hits its interval, it will send one and only one packet of 10 kg enriched uranium to the reactor, which is how much the reactor uses every day. So it uses 10 kg a day. We put 10 kg a day. So once I have primed the reactor with my desired amount of uranium, that will continually, keep it running. I will mention that I've had some minor issues with this setup that I do not have fully resolved. Namely, that when this is set to 0.1, it sometimes occasionally seems to miss an inject and not put the uranium that day, which means this will eventually sometimes slowly over hundreds of cycles, drop in uranium going down to like 20, 30 kg or so, and you'll see the power going down to your turbines, and it'll be pretty obvious when that happens. But when I put it any higher, like if I put it to 0.2, it sometimes does a double insert, like it'll put 2 packets instead of 1, and that is a bigger problem than it putting too little. Like I would rather have the reactor occasionally miss a packet and then me having to manual insert it rather than it overheat, get too hot, and break everything that's inside. If you did have everything in here made out of thermium, then you could just crank the whole thing to 11 and, not have to worry about this. But it is something you do need to be concerned with when you're making this out of steel. We're running at a nice, 200, 215, sometimes 220 degrees up here. So we're not that far away from the limit of steel. And as you can see with this, when the water goes up, the water is way higher than the temperature. This is also why you want a decent amount of steam in the chamber, so when that water is spit out, it immediately turns to steam and is normalized with the temperature of the rest of the steam, and you don't just have this small cloud of like super hot steam in a very like low pressure environment that then's going to overheat everything. Excuse me, I'm sorry. This little thermosensor right here is a little warning that I set up to try to mitigate that. I think ideally this probably should have been further to the edge or something. I had to set it relatively high to avoid false positives, but this just spits out a little warning, like letting me know that the reactor is starting to get hot and may require my attention. Not necessary, but nice thing to have. So over here, finishing off what's on this side, the liquid just comes through this valve and goes through the switch. A note about priming the reactor. So when you're initially turning this on for the full time, if you have a design setup like this, you need to babysit it for a little bit because, you know, as I said, this water will drain very, very quickly. So you need to flip this switch on and off when it's starting up to just keep inserting little bits of water until it's self-sustained, and then you want to insert more water until you hit your desired steam pressure. As I said, 150 kg is when it overpressures. I generally go by a rule of thumb of like stay under 100 kg in just about everything, steam chambers, you know, geothermal plant, whatever. The geothermal vents also overpressurize. A slightly different number, I believe it's 120 kg, but you know, it's close enough to 150, so I just remember stay under 100, otherwise things start overpressuring and not working correctly. So we are using this reactor for a lot of different things right now. Became a big fan of nuclear in this run. I had built this slightly cruder version of this design in a previous run. You can find that in the 80-minute video recap I did of the 2K Cycle Series normal difficulty run. This is max difficulty, blasted, though, and because it's blasted, my geothermal vents were underneath the magma. This all used to be magma, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But because these were much harder to get to and get going, I needed a power source that I could get operational much more quickly than the geothermal. And as I said at the beginning of the video, the geothermal plant and sour gas boilers, they don't give you rocket fuel. Like your mid-game main power project ideally is something that's going to give you both power and rocket fuel. So as far as the rocket fuel goes, rad bolt generators go up here straight up through there, and we have this nice little column which feeds our rad bolt rockets. I made a video about this all the rocket infrastructure. I'll link that in the description for those of you who've missed it. Also have a diamond press here. It's worth noting that this thing uses a ridiculous number of rad bolts, and if you actually want to use this in any major capacity, you probably want to go with the infinite liquid storage method for generating a much higher level of rad bolts. That method is complete overkill for anything except this, but yeah, the amount of rad bolts this thing uses for diamond produced is actually obscene. It's 1,000 rad bolts for 100 kg diamond, so 10 rad bolts per kg for diamond is a lot of rad bolts, and this will not be enough. Like, this is more than enough radiation and rad bolts for your rockets, for your plants and everything, but this is the one thing that it's not enough for. But honestly, I consider space mining to be kind of one of the shittier parts of the game. I tend to avoid it unless I absolutely have to. But it is something you do need to be aware of. On the left here, I've got the plants that I'm trying to mutate. You need to be mindful of the substance that you're using on the walls for your reactor. It's interesting to note that ceramic actually blocks less radiation than igneous. Igneous is 60, ceramic is 52. Most plants that you're trying to mutate will have a radiation threshold of about 4,000. The squash that I originally did was 4,600. And I now have a nice little row of exuberant squash. Ignore the fact that they're missing irrigation right now. We were doing some work on the ranches, and the seal ethanol production got temporarily suspended. It'll be back online soon. But some of these higher plants, higher radiation plants, like salt vine 7,400, I think sleet wheat is 11K or something like that. The industrial plants seem to be higher than the food plants for the most part. These will take a lot longer to mutate and are a bit harder to get the mutated versions that you want quickly. I needed 25 of these. I wanted a dash of salt vine juicy fruits to match my 2 chlorine geysers. And it looks like, I'm going to be finishing this run before I get all the plants I need, because even at this point I have 14, so still 11 short of the 25 that I wanted to get. But that being said, this is by far the best way to mutate plants. that I have found. I have tried other methods. I did the radiation, lamps in the early game where I had 2 rows of radiation lamps on either sides of a bunch of plants, and then had some sensors set up to turn them on and blast the whole thing with radiation when dupes enter to harvest. Dupes need to harvest these plants. I originally had set this up with some automation, as you can see, and it's not really being used much anymore. They need to harvest the plants because farmers have bonus seed chances when they harvest things, and you need that bonus seed chance in order to have any reasonable in order to get your mutated plants within any reasonable amount of time. As you can see, it's plus 95.7% seed chance. So she's almost guaranteed to get seeds, I think. I'm actually not sure if it's additive or multiplicative. It might be multiplicative. But either way, regardless of whether it's additive or multiplicative, the farmers need to harvest these. Other than that, I've got this set up right now for salt vines. I had pipes here earlier for when I was doing the squash. It's nothing too fancy here. Down here, I've essentially got this set up to do radiation for the plants that aren't being mutated, the ones that are already mutated, because already mutated plants need 250 rads in order to grow. You can fine-tune the material at the bottom, especially if you're adding more rows. You just reduce the number of radiation shielding that you have up here. Max difficulty thing you need to be aware of. If you've played max difficulty at all, you've noticed that the rads can be really, really bad on max difficulty. They get rad sickness in 33 rads take absorbed, and they only eject 33 per cycle when they use the bathroom. The rad pill still is an additional 100, so that brings it up to 133 per cycle. Rad pills are almost completely mandatory on max difficulty on virtually everyone. I think roughly 75% of my dupes or so are using rad pills right now. I think the only people who aren't using them are the ones who really only just stay in the main base itself, such as my rancher, my chef, and a couple others, but almost everyone is on rad pills. For something like this, though, you need far more than that. You want radiation suits, lead suits, which reduce the radiation absorption by 60%, and then you absolutely want the aquatic diet. This radiation resistance is additive with the lead suits, 66% or so. Actually, I think it's exactly 66. So you go from 66 to 86, which means you go from taking 33% of radiation to 14. So aquatic diet is pretty shit if you're not using lead suits. Like if you're having radiation issues and you're like, oh, I'm gonna aquatic diet everybody on top of their rad pills, that's a that's a complete waste. That's just not worth it at all. But if you have the lead suit first, putting aquatic diet on top of that makes an enormous difference. It is kind of meant to be stacked with the lead suit. Even with this aquatic diet lead suits, very occasionally they still sometimes get minor rad sickness. Although now that I'm done working with most of the area, it's not as bad. But were I to add more plants down here and then have to increase the radiation down here because, every layer of these farm tiles blocks radiation, then, it's a chance that might come up again. A note on this, of all the materials you can make farm tiles out of all the ones I've tested, gold amalgam blocks radiation the least. So if you're putting your rows of hydroponic tiles next to your reactor in order to avoid spending phosphorite on wheezeworts, which also saves a little bit of dupe labor, then gold amalgam is the way to go. So out of this reactor, we are getting radiation for our mutating plants. We are getting radiation for our already mutated plants. We're getting rad bolts for rocket fuel, and we are getting power. This powers the entire base right now. I've got some nat gas gens that can kick on and supplement if needed, but they rarely turn on anymore. I've been careful to keep the power requirements of my base Not too high, even though this ridiculous thing essentially added like a kilowatt to my power draw. But, it's the price we pay for beauty. The last thing, and I think one of the most useful things that I discovered with this reactor and this run, was something I was not aware of before this run, is where you put your liquid nuclear waste. So I was originally spacing this, and you can see the old connection for that there. And I realized after a while of running it that the reactor is water neutral. Like, I had always thought it was water negative, because I thought some of the water got converted into the liquid nuclear waste, but it is not. Like, once you have a steam pressure in here, after hundreds of cycles, it will still be the same steam pressure. It will not go down, unlike the geothermal plant, which is water negative and requires occasional water injects to prevent an eventual power down. So every cycle, when this thing does its little thing, this is spitting out something like 100 kg of liquid nuclear waste. So that to get that straight, that's 10 kg of enriched uranium going in, turning into 100 kg of liquid nuclear waste. This liquid nuclear waste comes out at about 200 degrees. However, as mentioned earlier, it has a very high SHC of 8.0. Since we're on Blasted Series, I had a huge magma biome over here blocking the bottom part of the world. Now, we dug a shaft straight through, insulated it from the sides to make sure the transit tube wouldn't melt. But there's not a lot of stone on this map to begin with, because of the snow globe, etc. I've mined out most of the igneous that I could find, but it became pretty obvious that I needed another large source of igneous, especially because a lot of things on Ceres really want insulated pipes to keep water from freezing or to prevent other hot liquids traveling through the base from heating the base up. I was originally pretty hesitant to do this because I knew I would have to make the pipe out of ceramic in order to prevent it from heating the map. And when I made this, it cost me virtually all the ceramic I had at the time. And I thought that it was going to be a total waste. I was shocked at how effective this wound up being. By dropping the liquid nuclear waste onto the magma, it cooled the biome shockingly quickly. I started doing the drip roughly, I think, around cycle 800 or something like that. Less than 200 cycles after when I had started it, I essentially had the entire magma biome cooled. It was incredibly fast. If you've ever messed around with trying to use a geothermal plant to cool a magma biome or anything like that, you know how incredibly slow it can be, even with like an absolutely massive plant. This is by far the best way of cooling a magma biome that I've discovered. There are a few caveats though. First off, when it lands on the hot magma, it's going to vaporize the liquid nuclear waste into nuclear fallout. And that nuclear fallout is going to create a large gas cloud of fallout that is, going to be like 1,000 degrees or something like that, too hot to pump, even with thermium. Not to mention, you kind of want to get this going before you do space materials, because you want to get your nuclear reactor going so you can get your rad rockets going. So that kind of restricts its use to an area where you don't care about what's above it. This made it ideal for Blasted Series. Like, it was actually a match made in heaven. Because I could just drip it right here, and all that fallout would eventually just go out to space, and is now just a vacuum again. It's worth noting that the igneous rock is obviously still pretty hot. It's around 900 degrees here still. I've dug out quite a bit on the left side, and there's still a good bit on the right side, but I've got 300 tons right now, so we're fine for the time being. And a trick that I did this run, something which was also new for me this run, it was kind of another one of those off-the-cuff, like, quick Band-Aid solutions that eventually turned out to be a really good idea, and by eventually I mean very quickly, was I made this giant walk-in freezer. So this is my Metalworks, it's also cooling, and the ATSTs there also cool the SPOM, and I just extended that nectar coolant loop down here through this big walk-in freezer. So this entire area is this nice, minus 55 degrees right now. It's super cold down there. And so what I would do is I created a area that I could lock a door and block off an automatic dispenser. And I put all the good igneous I had in there, all the igneous that wasn't too hot, and then locked that door so I had no igneous available, mined up a bunch, and then made a bunch of temp shift plates through here. And then those temp shift plates would cool down. I would deconstruct them, remove the connection from the bottom, have them put the igneous in here, and then repeat the process. And that's how I essentially strip mined most of the igneous and got it at a reasonable temperature, I believe. As you can see, yeah, this is all at minus 15, 12, the 35 degree igneous that's over there was actually mined from down here, and so I didn't bother cooling it further. And the reason you need to do this is because when you are building stuff out of hot tiles, it will snap it down, it will cap the temperature when you build it to 45 degrees. However, there are two phases to the building process. There's the supplying phase and the construction. First, the material is brought to the construction site and put on the tile where it's going to be built, and then a builder will build it and turn it into whatever it's supposed to be. When that initial material is sitting there and it has not been built yet, it has not been temp capped yet. So that debris, those raw resources, if they are super hot, they can heat the hell out of the surrounding area. I actually had a bit of a crisis where I was doing some work over here and I got lazy and heated this door up to like 500 degrees because the pipe behind it that I had built, the igneous pipe I had built, this was made from superheated igneous. And that's actually what led to the whole freezer construction thing. So, yeah, there you have it. Liquid nuclear waste, by far the best way to cool a magma biome, but regardless of how you cool a magma biome, doing something like this and micromanaging your debris temperature will save you a lot of headache in the long run, especially on series where temperature control is very important. All right, so I believe that covers just about everything for the nuclear reactor. I hope you enjoyed this video. I stream most days, evenings Pacific, at Twitch TV SF Hobbit. And thanks for watching.